Hey there. We hope you enjoy this short story. If you do, please consider sharing it with a friend. And if you'd like to stay connected, sign up for our mailing list. The link is in the show description. You'll get behind-the-scenes insights into our stories and be the first to hear what's coming next. You can also join us on your social network. Just search for The Listening Lamp and subscribe and follow. Now, let's begin. The listening lamp flickers to life, illuminating the space between worlds. Here, science whispers to spirit, and reality bends to imagination. Curl up in the cosmic glow as we unveil the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. The Watcher, a short story written by Rob Corrigan, narrated by Ava Clark.
The snow spoke different languages depending on how it fell. Tonight it whispered Kanialak, light, feathery flakes that drifted like down through the Arctic darkness. Evelyne adjusted her spotting scope, tracking the alpha wolf she'd designated as number 8 through the ethereal curtain of snow. His dark form moved with fluid grace across the tundra, pausing occasionally to test the wind. The digital display inside her observation blind showed minus 42 degrees Celsius, cold enough that even her breath froze before it could fog the scope's lens. She'd learned to time her breathing with her observations, holding each exhale until after she'd recorded her notes. Her pencil moved across the page with practiced efficiency. 23:47 hours. N8 displaying regular patrol pattern along ridge. Third night consecutive. Pack remains denned below pressure ridge approx. 2.4 kilometers northeast of blind. Snow conditions ideal for tracking. Through the scope, number 8 suddenly turned his head, yellow eyes seeming to stare directly into her lens. Evelyne felt that familiar jolt, the unsettling sensation that she wasn't the only one doing the observing. She'd spent 11 months documenting this pack's behavior, but moments like these still made her skin prickle. The wolf held his gaze on her position for exactly 12 seconds before continuing his patrol. Evelyne added to her notes. Direct eye contact maintained 12 seconds, third recorded instance this week. She flexed her fingers inside her caribou skin mittens, the ones she'd been taught to make long ago. The synthetic gloves preferred by other researchers couldn't match the wisdom sewn into each traditional stitch. Just as the Inuktitut words for snow carried knowledge that English couldn't capture, some tools only worked when they were made the old way. The blind's radio crackled. Base to blind 3, weather update. Evelyne kept her eyes on number 8 as she responded. Blind 3, go ahead. Low pressure system intensifying off Ungava Bay. Storm warning upgraded to severe. Recommend evacuation of observation posts within 24 hours. She watched number 8 pause again, nose testing the wind. Acknowledged. We'll begin shutdown procedure at first light. The wolf turned toward the east, where the storm would come from. Even at this distance, Evelyne could read the tension in his posture. The pack hadn't started denning up yet, which was unusual given the approaching weather. Their behavior over the past week had defied her careful categorization. Her grandmother's voice surfaced in memory. When the animals don't follow their patterns, they're following something else. She'd dismissed such thoughts during her university years, wrapped in the certainty of scientific methodology. But 11 months on the ice had taught her that methodology could only capture part of what happened out here. Number 8 disappeared into the thickening snow, but not before casting one final glance toward her blind. Evelyne noted the time and behavior, then added an observation she'd never include in her official report. Subject continues to demonstrate awareness of observation that exceeds documented patterns of wolf behavior. The Kanialak was changing, growing heavier, its whispers becoming murmurs. Soon it would speak in yet another dialect of white. Evelyne began preparing for the long night ahead, her movements precise in the familiar confines of the blind. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the first hints of what was coming. She didn't know it yet, but in 3 days' time, she would be forced to question everything she thought she understood about what she watched, and what watched her in return. For now, she simply made her notes, counted her supplies, and settled in as the darkness deepened beyond her small pool of light. Number 8's tracks were already filling with new snow, transforming from clear prints into subtle suggestions of passage. Soon, they would disappear completely, as if he'd never been there at all. But Evelyne knew better. Out here, nothing truly disappeared. It just changed form, like snow itself, speaking in different tongues to those who knew how to listen. Morning arrived as a gradual lightening of gray, the sun too low on the horizon to do more than suggest its presence. Evelyne moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, recording temperature, minus 38 degrees Celsius, wind speed, 15 knots gusting to 25, and snow accumulation, 4.7 centimeters of new powder over old pack. But it was the quality of the snow that held her attention. "Pookok," she murmured, studying the crystalline layer near the ground through her magnifying glass. The sugar snow, full of air pockets, spoke of instability in the pack. Above it, she recognized Evelyne, the snow that formed when wind packed crystals so tightly they became almost like glass. She recorded the scientific terms in her log, but thought in the words she'd learned as a child, each one carrying layers of meaning that English couldn't touch. Movement caught her eye. Number 8's pack emerging from their den site. She counted 7 wolves, but the alpha himself remained absent. Through her scope, she watched them move with unusual hesitation, testing the snow repeatedly before committing their weight to each step. Pack displaying atypical morning behavior, she noted. Possible response to changing pressure system. The crack of ice shifting somewhere on the bay punctuated her observation. The sound carried memories of other mornings, other lessons. Her grandmother teaching her to read the snow's layers like pages in a book, each crystal formation telling its own story. "When the snow changes quickly," the old woman had said, "the spirits are restless." The radio interrupted her thoughts. "Base to all blinds, storm system accelerating. Expect conditions to deteriorate within 36 hours. Begin evacuation procedures." Evelyne acknowledged the call but didn't immediately begin packing. Something about the wolves' behavior demanded her attention. They'd formed an unusual pattern, moving in what appeared to be a search grid. She'd documented similar behavior when they hunted, but this was different, more ordered, almost methodical. A shadow moved at the edge of her scope's field of view. Number 8 had appeared on the ridge above his pack, his dark fur stark against the white. He stood perfectly still, and once again, Evelyne felt the weight of his gaze through her lens. "Subject appears to be..." She started to write, then stopped. The wolf's posture suggested something she couldn't quite name, not aggression or territorial display, but something more deliberate. Almost like he's keeping watch, she whispered. The thought carried echoes of old stories, tales she'd heard in her youth about wolves that weren't simply wolves. Her scientific training rejected such ideas, but out here, where the division between earth and sky became as blurry as the horizon, certainty felt more flexible. The pack abruptly changed direction, moving as one toward the east. Number 8 remained on his ridge for exactly 30 seconds before following. Evelyne quickly noted their coordinates, overlaying their movement pattern on her topographical map. The resulting track formed a clear line pointing directly at her blind 3 position. She forced herself to record only observable facts: time, direction, numbers. But her hand added an unauthorized postscript. Pack movement suggests organized response to external factors, not yet identified. The wind shifted, bringing with it a scent of snow unlike anything she documented this season. Her instruments showed the expected readings: temperature, humidity, barometric pressure. But they couldn't capture the electric feeling in the air, the way the light seemed to bend strangely around the distant peaks. More ice shifted in the bay, the sound deeper this time, more resonant. The wolves paused their movement, heads lifted, listening. Number 8 turned once more toward Evelyne's position, and in that moment, through her scope, she could have sworn his eyes held more than animal intelligence. Focus, she told herself firmly. Observable facts only. But as she began dismantling her auxiliary equipment, preparing for evacuation, old words surfaced unbidden in her mind. Words for things that couldn't be measured or cataloged. Silavinic, the spirit of weather. Amaruk, wolf, but also something more than wolf. Her satellite phone chirped with an incoming message. The storm had accelerated again. Expected arrival now within 24 hours. She needed to move quickly, to follow procedure, to trust in preparation and equipment. All the things her training had taught her to rely on. Yet something made her hesitate, made her watch Number 8's pack disappearing into the growing murk. Their movement remained purposeful, coordinated, like they were following a map she couldn't see, preparing for something her instruments couldn't measure. The bay ice cracked again, the sound like thunder rolling across the tundra. This time, Evelyne allowed herself to hear it as more than shifting pressure and temperature differentials. For just a moment, she listened the way she'd been taught as a child, not just with her ears, but with something deeper, something that recognized warnings in more than decibels and frequency. Observable facts, she repeated, but her voice lacked conviction. Because the most observable fact of all was one she couldn't record in her log. Something was coming that wouldn't fit in any of her careful categories. The question was whether her scientific training or her older knowledge would prove more valuable in the days ahead. The storm advanced like a living thing, consuming the horizon. Evelyne checked her monitors compulsively, watching numbers spiral into unprecedented patterns. The barometer's descent looked almost impossible, like something out of the stories elders told about the great storms, the ones that reshaped the land itself. Through her scope, she tried to maintain visual contact with Number 8's pack. The wolves had moved to higher ground, their dark forms ghosting between rocks and snowdrifts. Their movement pattern defied her careful documentation. Not hunting, not patrolling, but something else. Something almost like preparation. Pack maintaining elevation of 340 meters, she recorded, her pencil moving steadily despite the tremor in her hand. Formation suggests. She stopped, erased, began again. Formation indicates. No, the words wouldn't come, because what she was seeing didn't match any behavioral pattern in her research. The wolves moved in concentric circles, Number 8 always on the outermost ring. Every few minutes, he would stop, turn toward her blind, and seem to measure the distance with his gaze. The rest of the pack moved in perfect synchronization, like dancers following choreography she couldn't quite grasp. Her satellite phone chirped. Another update from base. Storm accelerating beyond models. Immediate evacuation order for all observation posts. Evelyne began her shutdown procedure, hands moving through practiced motions, while her eyes remained fixed on the scope. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees in the past hour, and the snow had changed again. Not powder now, but something crystalline and sharp that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. The snowmobile's engine turned over, but sounded wrong. A hesitation in the idle she'd never heard before. She should check it, but number 8 had just done something that demanded her attention. The wolf stood atop an ice ridge, his posture unlike anything she'd documented in 11 months of observation. Head high, ears forward, body tense, but not with aggression or hunting focus. He looked expectant. A crack like breaking glass rippled across the tundra. Evelyne recognized the sound of sea ice shifting, but this was different. Deeper, more resonant. The kind of sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her grandmother's voice surfaced in memory. When the ice sings like that, something walks between the worlds. Focus, Evelyne whispered to herself. Observable phenomena only. But her hand was already moving across her notebook, recording things her scientific training told her to ignore. The way shadows stretched longer than they should, how the snow crystals caught light at impossible angles, the sense that something vast and aware was gathering itself just beyond the edge of vision. The wolves began to move down from their elevation, but not in the random scatter of animals fleeing weather. They maintained their circular pattern, number 8 still on the outside, still pausing regularly to fix Evelyne's position with his gaze. They weren't running from the storm. They were... what? Escorting it? Welcoming it? Her radio crackled with static-laden voices demanding status updates. She should respond, should start the snowmobile despite its worrying sound, should trust her equipment and training over these strange patterns she was seeing. Instead, she found herself reaching for her grandmother's amulet, the one she'd sworn she only wore out of habit. Her fingers traced its worn curves as she watched number 8 make another measured turn toward her blind. The wolf's eyes caught the strange light, reflecting it back with an intensity that shouldn't have been visible at this distance. For a moment, Evelyne could have sworn she saw something else looking back at her through those eyes, something that knew her, not as observer or scientist, but as... The snowmobile's engine coughed and died. The sound shocked her back to practical concerns. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. The storm front was visibly advancing now, a wall of white that erased everything in its path. Her instruments screamed warnings about wind speed and pressure drops. She turned the key again. The engine whined, but wouldn't catch. Through her scope, she saw number 8 make one final turn toward her position. His pack had completed their circular pattern and now moved as one toward deeper cover. But the Alpha remained, watching, until the storm's advancing wall swallowed him from view. Evelyne's hands moved across her notebook one last time, recording what might be her final observation. Subject appears to be... She stopped, looked at what she'd written, then deliberately crossed it out. Some things, she was beginning to understand, couldn't be recorded in the language of observable facts. The storm came on like night falling, and in its darkness, Evelyne felt the first real tendril of fear. Not of the cold or wind she knew how to survive, but of what else might be walking in this white darkness, singing through the cracking ice, watching with eyes that reflected impossible light. The snowmobile's engine made one final futile attempt to turn over, then fell silent. And in that silence, Evelyne heard the ice sing again. The world disappeared in white violence. Evelyne had grown up with storms, had studied their patterns, had learned to read their moods in the texture of snowflakes and the pitch of wind. But this was different. This storm didn't howl. It screamed, a sound that bypassed her ears and vibrated in her bones. "Maintain shelter," she muttered through cold-numbed lips, fighting to secure her blind against winds that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Conserve heat. Wait for rescue." The words of her training felt hollow against the storm's fury. Her satellite phone was dead. Not just battery drained, but completely lifeless. Its screen crystallized with strange patterns that shouldn't have been possible. The radio offered nothing but static that sounded almost like voices singing in the distance. The temperature had dropped to -51 degrees Celsius, cold enough that the difference between exhale and inhale felt like swallowing glass. But it was the quality of the cold that disturbed her. It seemed to have weight, presence, intention. "Pursursik," she whispered, using the old word for blizzard. But that wasn't quite right. This was something else, something the elders had different words for, words she'd dismissed as superstition until now. A particularly violent gust tore at her blind's anchors. Through the white wall of storm, Evelyne caught glimpses of darker shapes moving. Probably just snow devils, she told herself. Wind-whipped snow taking on the appearance of motion, of purpose. Her emergency beacon blinked steadily, but she had no way to know if its signal was reaching anyone through this atmospheric chaos. The snowmobile sat useless, already half buried in snow that didn't fall so much as materialize, appearing between one blink and the next. She had perhaps 3 hours of shelter if the blind held, less if it didn't. The logical choice was to wait, to trust in her emergency procedures and equipment. But something older than logic spoke to her through the storm's voice, through the way the shadows moved, through the growing certainty that she wasn't alone in this whiteness. Another shape moved through the snow, larger this time, more defined. Wolf-like, but the proportions were wrong, distorted by the storm or by something else. It vanished before she could focus on it properly. The blind's frame groaned against another assault from the wind. One of the support poles snapped with a sound like breaking bone. Evelyne did the calculations quickly. Wind speed, temperature, visibility distance. The numbers told her staying put meant death. Moving meant only probable death. She began packing with swift efficiency. Spare batteries, emergency rations, the satellite phone even though it was dead. Her hands moved through the motions while her mind calculated coordinates, trying to map a route to the nearest emergency shelter. It was a challenging trek in good weather. In this, the storm's pitch changed, deepened. The shadows moved again, closer now. Through the white wall, Evelyne caught a flash of eyes reflecting light that shouldn't have been there. The shape was wolf-sized, but something about its movement made her breath catch. "Number 8, she whispered. The figure vanished, but not before she saw it with a clarity that defied the storm's chaos. The wolf stood like a piece of night cut into the whiteness, his eyes reflecting something more than light. For just a moment, she thought she saw patterns in his fur that looked almost like the amulet around her neck. Then the blind's second support pole gave way. Evelyne moved without conscious thought, grabbing her survival pack and pushing through the collapsing shelter into the storm's full fury. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but she forced herself forward, using the wind's direction to orient herself. The shape appeared again, more distinct now. Number 8, or something wearing his form, stood like a shadow against the snow. As she watched, 2 more shapes materialized beside him, then others, forming a loose circle in the whiteness. "Observable facts," she gasped through freezing lips. But what she observed defied recording. The wolves' movements created patterns in the snow, curves and spirals that seemed to push back against the storm's chaos. Their eyes reflected light that had no source, and their fur rippled with markings that seemed to shift between one heartbeat and the next. The storm pressed in, trying to erase everything in its white silence. Evelyne felt the cold reaching for her core, felt the first numbness creeping into her thoughts. She took another step, fighting against wind that wanted to reshape her into ice and memory. Number 8's form appeared again, closer now. His eyes met hers with an intelligence that transcended species. Around him, the other wolves moved in their endless circle, their passage somehow holding back the storm's fury, just enough to create a space where survival might be possible. If she could trust what she was seeing. If this wasn't just the beginning of hypothermia's fatal dreams. The wolf's eyes reflected impossible light one more time. Then he turned and began walking into the white darkness. The rest of the pack moved with him, maintaining their circular pattern, creating a pocket of almost calm in the storm's chaos. Evelyne stood at the edge of everything she understood, everything she could explain or record or verify. Before her, Number 8's dark form took another step into the whiteness, then paused, waiting. The storm screamed its hunger. The cold reached for her with icy fingers. And in that moment of choice, Evelyne did the only thing she could. She followed. Every step became an act of defiance against death. Evelyne couldn't feel her feet anymore, could barely distinguish between ground and air in the total whiteness that consumed everything. Only the dark shape ahead gave her direction, Number 8's form appearing and disappearing like a mirage, always just visible enough to follow. Around her, other wolves moved in their mysterious pattern, their bodies creating brief walls against the wind's fury. She tried to count them, to maintain some semblance of scientific observation, but the numbers kept shifting. 6 wolves, 8, 12. Their forms seemed to multiply and divide in the storm's chaos. "Keep moving," she muttered through frozen lips. Her words froze instantly, tiny crystals of sound lost in the white silence. The cold had moved past pain into a deeper burning, the kind that preceded the final numbness. She recognized the stages of hypothermia with clinical detachment. First the shivering, then the confusion, then the paradoxical sensation of warmth. Number 8 appeared again, closer this time. His eyes caught light that couldn't exist in this darkness, reflecting it back with amber intensity. The markings in his fur shifted like northern lights, forming patterns that reminded her of her grandmother's stories, tales of spirit wolves who walked between worlds, guarding the boundaries between this reality and others. "Not real," she gasped. "Hypothermia-induced hallucination." But even as she spoke, the wolves' circular movement created something measurable, a subtle lessening of the wind's force, a space where survival might be possible. Their passage left patterns in the snow that seemed to glow with their own pale light, curves and spirals that pushed back against the storm's chaos. Time lost meaning. Evelyne walked through white eternity, following a wolf that might be real, or might be death wearing a familiar shape. The other wolves wove around her in their endless dance, their bodies increasingly transparent, increasingly impossible. Sometimes she thought she saw human forms moving among them, figures wearing parkas made of night and starlight. The cold reached deeper, past flesh and bone, touching something fundamental. Evelyne felt herself beginning to fade, felt the boundaries of herself growing thin. The wolf's pattern began to make a different kind of sense. Not just movement, but meaning. Not just tracks, but text written in a language older than words. Number 8 stopped. Through vision that was beginning to blur, Evelyne saw him turn towards her fully. His eyes met hers with an intelligence that seemed to transcend ordinary consciousness. Around him, the other wolves drew their circle tighter, their bodies pressing close, sharing what warmth they had. "Why?" she tried to ask, but her voice had frozen somewhere between thought and sound. The wolf's eyes held hers, and in them she saw something ancient and familiar looking back. The markings in his fur moved like constellations, like the patterns in her grandmother's amulet, like the curves and spirals scientists had found carved in stones older than history. Evelyne felt the last of her strength giving way. As she sank to her knees in the snow, the wolves moved closer still, their circle becoming a wall of fur and warmth. Number 8 pressed against her side, his body impossibly warm against the storm's killing cold. She should be dead. The rational, scientific part of her mind insisted that survival was impossible in these conditions. But the wolves kept their vigil, their bodies creating a shelter of flesh and spirit against the white silence. Through increasingly distant awareness, Evelyne felt other presences gathering, shapes that were not quite wolf and not quite human, forms that seemed to shift between one breath and the next. Time stretched, twisted, folded in on itself. Evelyne drifted in and out of consciousness, each return marked by the steady pressure of warm bodies against hers, by Number 8's eyes reflecting impossible light. Sometimes she thought she heard singing, ancient songs in languages she almost remembered. Sometimes she thought she saw her grandmother's face among the watchers, smiling with quiet approval. The storm raged beyond their circle, but within it, Evelyne floated in a space between heartbeats. The cold became distant, held at bay by warmth that felt both physical and spiritual. Number 8's presence remained constant, his form somehow more solid than the others, as if he were anchoring this pocket of survival in the chaos of the storm. Her last clear thought, before consciousness faded completely, was that some things could only be understood by surrendering the need to understand them. Some truths lived in the space between observation and experience, in the white silence where all boundaries became fluid. The storm sang its ancient songs. The wolves kept their circular vigil. And somewhere between one moment and the next, Evelyne let go of the need to explain what she was experiencing. In that surrender, she found something else. Something that felt like understanding, but went deeper than knowledge. The white silence held her like a mother holding a child, and in that embrace, she slept. Evelyne drifted between states of consciousness, wrapped in a cocoon of warmth that defied the killing cold beyond. The wolves' bodies pressed close, their presence both physical and something else, something that existed in the space between heartbeats, between thoughts, between what she could explain and what she could only experience. Time lost its straight edge, becoming fluid, circular. In one moment, she was a child again, listening to her grandmother's stories about the spirit guardians who walked in storms. In another, she was in her university office, confidently explaining wolfpack dynamics to eager students. Past and present flowed together like snow driven by wind. Number 8's form remained constant through these shifts, his eyes reflecting that impossible light. Sometimes she thought she saw markings in his fur that matched the ancient patterns carved in her grandmother's amulet. Sometimes those patterns seemed to move, flowing like northern lights across his dark coat. "You're not real," she whispered through cracked lips. "None of this is real." But even as she spoke, her scientist's mind registered observable facts. The steady pressure of bodies against hers, the measurable warmth they provided, the way their circular pattern created a space where the storm's fury couldn't quite reach. other presences moved at the edge of her awareness. Forms that weren't quite wolf and weren't quite human, their shapes suggesting something her mind couldn't quite grasp. They left no tracks in the snow, but their passage created patterns of frost that spiraled outward like ancient petroglyphs coming alive. The storm's voice changed, its howl becoming something closer to singing. Through half-closed eyes, Evelyne watched snow crystals dance in impossible formations, creating momentary mandalas that contained entire universes of meaning. She recognized words written in their brief geometries, not English or Inuktitut, but something older that spoke directly to the blood and bone of her. Number 8 pressed closer, his warmth seeping into her frozen core. Around them, the other wolves maintained their vigil, their bodies forming a living shelter against the white chaos beyond. But were they wolves? In her increasingly fluid state of consciousness, Evelyne saw them shift and change. One moment ordinary animals, the next something that had walked the earth's streams since the first snow fell. "Stay with us," a voice seemed to say, though she couldn't tell if it spoke in words or in the pressure of warm bodies against hers. Stay in this space between. Her grandmother's amulet pulsed against her chest, its warmth matching the rhythm of number 8's breathing. The patterns carved into it began to move, or perhaps it was just the storm's light playing tricks on her fading vision. They flowed like water, like mercury, like time itself becoming visible. Evelyne felt herself becoming lighter, less solid. The boundaries between herself and the storm, between warmth and cold, between what she knew and what she was experiencing, grew thin as new snow. Through it all, number 8's presence anchored her, his form somehow more real than anything else in this space between moments. The other wolves began to sing, not howling, but something deeper, older. Their voices harmonized with the storm's voice, creating music that spoke of ice ages and star paths, of migrations older than memory, of guardians who walked the boundaries between worlds. "Remember," they seemed to say, though no words were spoken. "Remember what you knew before you learned to forget." Evelyne drifted deeper into this space between worlds, held safe in a circle of beings that were both wolves and not wolves, both present and eternal. The storm raged beyond their protection, but here in this pocket of calm, she floated in a place where all things were possible and no explanations were necessary. Number 8's eyes met hers once more, and in them she saw something ancient and familiar looking back. Not just a wolf's intelligence, but something that had watched over the tundra since the first snows fell, since the first humans learned to read the weather's moods, since the first stories were told about guardians who walked in storms. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper, "Some things can only be understood by surrendering the need to understand them." The storm sang its ancient songs. The wolves kept their circular vigil. And Evelyne floated in this space between worlds, between heartbeats, between what she could explain and what she could only accept. Time stretched, curved, folded in on itself. The white silence held her like a mother holding a child. And somewhere in that eternal moment, Evelyne let go of the last need to explain what was happening. She simply was, and that was enough. Light reached through the white darkness like a hand parting curtains. Evelyne surfaced slowly from depths she couldn't quite remember, awareness returning in fragments. The weight of her limbs, the rhythm of her breathing, the gradual recognition that she was somehow impossibly alive. Smooth walls of snow curved around her in a perfect circle, a shelter sculpted by wind or by something else. The storm's violence felt distant now, muted. as if she were at the eye of a hurricane made of ice and memory. Her body ached with cold that should have been fatal, but somehow wasn't. "Hello?" Her voice emerged as a whisper of frost. No answer came except the soft sigh of wind over snow. Light grew stronger, bringing color back to a world that had been stripped to white and shadow. The snow walls around her held patterns, not random drifts, but deliberate curves and spirals that reminded her of the markings she'd seen in Number 8's fur, or thought she'd seen. Already, the night's experiences were taking on the quality of dreams. Movement caught her eye, a shadow passing beyond the snow walls. Through translucent ice, she saw a darker shape pause, turn. For a moment, she glimpsed eyes reflecting dawn's first light. Then the figure was gone, leaving only tracks in the fresh snow. Evelyne forced herself to move, every muscle protesting as she crawled from her shelter into strengthening daylight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Snow lay in drifts that seemed to follow some strange geometry, curves and spirals extending outward from her position like ripples in a frozen pond. Her scientist's mind tried to catalog, to explain. Wind patterns, temperature variations, the natural forces that could create such formations. But the patterns held a deliberate quality that defied simple explanation. They reminded her of the circular movements she'd glimpsed through the storm's chaos, of bodies moving in ancient rhythms. The tracks led away from her shelter, wolf prints, ordinary in size and shape. But they formed a perfect circle around where she'd lain, as if the pack had maintained their vigil until dawn broke. Beyond that circle, the tracks multiplied, overlapped, created shapes that almost looked like words written in a language older than writing. A helicopter's distant thrum reached her through the crystal air. Search and rescue, no doubt, following her emergency beacon's signal. Soon they would arrive with their questions, their medical checks, their rational explanations for her survival. She looked down at her hands, expecting frostbite's black kiss. But her skin was pink, healthy. Cold, yes, but nowhere near the tissue death that should have occurred after exposure to such temperatures. Her grandmother's amulet lay against her chest, its carved patterns catching the strengthening light. More tracks caught her attention, leading away from the circle. These were different, larger, deeper, their edges already softening with blown snow. Something had walked here that wasn't quite wolf, wasn't quite anything she could name. The prints extended for 3 paces, then simply stopped, as if their maker had stepped into air. The helicopter grew louder. Through her scope, still somehow intact despite the storm, Evelyne caught movement on a distant ridge. Number 8 stood watching, his form solid and real in the morning light. No strange markings moved in his fur now. No impossible light reflected in his eyes. Just a wolf, watching with ordinary animal intelligence. And yet, he turned away as the helicopter approached, his pack materializing around him like shadows coming alive. They moved with fluid grace through the transformed landscape, their passage leaving ordinary tracks in the snow. Soon they were gone, swallowed by distance and light. Evelyne heard voices calling her name, saw figures approaching through the strange spiral patterns left by the storm. She tried one last time to make sense of what had happened, to reconcile what she'd experienced with what she could explain. The morning light caught crystal edges, making the snow patterns glitter like scattered diamonds. For a moment, she thought she saw other shapes moving in that play of light and shadow, forms that were neither wolf nor human, neither past nor present, but something that existed in the spaces between such simple categories. Then, the shapes were gone, leaving only questions and tracks that were already filling with snow and memories that felt both more and less real than the rational explanations that would soon be offered. The rescue team reached her, their voices full of amazement at finding her alive, at finding her unharmed, at finding her at all in this transformed landscape. She answered their questions automatically, letting them check her vital signs, wrap her in thermal blankets, express their disbelief at her condition. But her eyes kept straying to the distant ridge where she'd last seen number 8, and to the strange patterns in the snow that were already beginning to fade, like writing on water, like breath on glass, like memories of things that could only be understood by accepting that some things couldn't be understood at all. The helicopter lifted her into a sky as blue as eternity. Below, the spiral patterns stretched to the horizon, telling a story she could read but never translate. Already, the landscape was beginning to shift and change, erasing all evidence of what had walked there in the night. All evidence except what remained in her heart, in her blood, in the spaces between what she could explain and what she could only remember. That would have to be enough. A week had passed since the rescue. Evelyne sat in her research station, staring at her notebook where 2 separate accounts of the storm lay side by side. The first was clinical, precise. Wind speeds, temperature readings, measurable facts that could be verified and cataloged. The second was something else entirely. Her fingers traced the words she'd written in those quiet hours between midnight and dawn, trying to capture what had happened before memory could reshape it into something more rational. The page held sketches of patterns she'd seen in the snow, in number 8's fur, in the spaces between moments. They matched, perfectly, the ancient designs carved in her grandmother's amulet. The medical reports lay on her desk, a stack of impossibilities dressed in scientific language. No frostbite, no hypothermia damage, no rational explanation for how she had survived temperatures that should have killed her within hours. Subject maintained core body temperature through unknown means, the doctor had written, his uncertainty showing in his careful choice of words. Possible explanations include, but his explanations fell short of what she had experienced. They couldn't account for the perfect circle of wolf tracks around her shelter, each print exactly the same distance from the next, forming a pattern that defied natural behavior. They couldn't explain the spiral formations in the snow that had stretched for miles, visible in satellite photos that were already being disputed as camera artifacts or weather anomalies. Through her window, she could see the tundra stretching white and empty to the horizon. Number 8's pack had vanished after that night, their radio collars gone silent, their usual hunting grounds abandoned. As if they had walked off the edge of the map, into spaces her instruments couldn't reach. Her sat phone chirped, another call from the university requesting her preliminary report. She let it ring. How could she write about what had happened in language her colleagues would accept? How could she translate experience into data, mystery into methodology? The sun caught the edge of her scope, still set up by the window. Almost against her will, she found herself drawn to it, adjusting the focus to scan the distant ridgeline. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a darker shape against the snow, eyes reflecting light in impossible ways. Then it was gone, leaving her uncertain if she'd seen anything at all. Her hand moved across the page, adding new notes in defiance of scientific protocol. Some experiences resist categorization. Some knowledge lives in the spaces between observable facts. What walked with me that night wore wolf shape, but carried older truths in its bones. She stopped, looked at what she'd written, started to cross it out. But something made her pause. A memory of number 8's eyes meeting hers through the storm, of ancient patterns moving like northern lights through his fur, of warmth shared between bodies that were both wolf and something else entirely. The rescue teams had found no trace of the shelter that had saved her life. The spiral patterns photographed from the air were already being explained away as natural phenomena, wind-carved formations that only appeared deliberate from certain angles. Even her own survival was being rationalized, a combination of good equipment, proper training, and extraordinary luck. But her grandmother's amulet still lay warm against her skin, its patterns matching exactly the tracks she'd found in the snow that morning. And in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, she sometimes heard wolves singing in harmonies that spoke of ice ages and star paths, of migrations older than memory. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision. She turned quickly, catching a glimpse of something in the gathering dusk. A form that was neither wolf nor spirit, but something that existed in the boundary between such simple definitions. When she looked again, it was gone. But it had left tracks in the fresh snow outside her window, 3 perfect prints that stopped abruptly, as if their maker had simply stepped into air. Evelyne turned back to her notebook, adding one final observation. Perhaps true understanding begins when we accept that some things can't be fully understood. They can only be experienced, remembered, honored for what they are. Mysteries that walk in wolf shape, guardians that move between moments, truths that live in the spaces between what we can explain and what we can only witness. The sun set over the tundra, painting the snow in colors that shouldn't exist. Somewhere in that gathering darkness, she knew, Number 8's pack was moving through spaces her instruments couldn't map, following paths older than science. And that knowledge, unexplainable as it was, felt more real than any data she could collect. The night deepened. The stars emerged. And in the silence between their ancient light, Evelyne thought she heard wolves singing songs that spoke of ice ages and spirit paths, of guardians who walked in storms, of truths that could only be understood by surrendering the need to understand them. She closed her notebook, content at last to let some mysteries remain mysterious. That too was its own kind of knowledge. The first snow of winter fell softly, each flake carrying its own story, written in crystalline light. Evelyne stood at her observation post, familiar weight of the scope in her hands, watching Number 8's pack move across the tundra below. They had returned 2 months after the storm, slipping back into their territory as if they had never left, leaving tracks that were perfectly, ordinarily wolf. Her official report sat finished on her desk, filled with the kind of observations and data points her colleagues would expect. She had written about wolf pack dynamics, about territorial behaviors, about measurable, documentable facts. She had not written about other things, about patterns that moved like starlight through dark fur, about circles in the snow that held back killing storms, about truths that lived in the spaces between what could be proven and what could only be known. Through her scope, she watched Number 8 pause at the edge of a ridge. His form was solid, real, just a wolf, moving through his world with ordinary animal grace. No strange markings shifted through his fur, no impossible light reflected in his eyes. And yet, he turned his head, gaze meeting hers through the lens with that familiar intensity. For just a moment, she thought she saw other shapes moving around him, forms that were neither wolf nor spirit, but something that existed in the boundary between such simple definitions. Then they were gone, leaving only ordinary wolves moving through ordinary snow. Her hand went to her grandmother's amulet, its patterns warm against her skin. She had stopped trying to explain what had happened that night. Some experiences, she had learned, resisted translation into data points and methodology. Some knowledge could only live in the blood and bone of remembering. The pack moved with fluid grace through the gathering dusk, their passage leaving tracks that would soon be filled by fresh snow. Number 8 led them in patterns that might have been random, might have been meaningful, might have been both or neither, depending on how one chose to observe them. Evelyne made her notes in 2 separate books now. One held the kind of observations that would satisfy her scientific colleagues. The other held different truths, written in a language that spoke more of mystery than measurement. The snow deepened as darkness gathered. Through her scope, she watched number 8 make one final turn toward her position. His eyes caught the last light, reflecting it back in ways that might have been ordinary, might have been something else. Around him, shadows moved that might have been other wolves, might have been guardians who walked between worlds, might have been both or neither, or something else entirely. And Evelyne found she no longer needed to choose which explanation to believe. She had learned that some truths could hold multiple shapes at once, like snow that was both crystal and light, like wolves that were both flesh and spirit, like knowledge that lived in the spaces between observation and experience. The night deepened. Stars emerged. And somewhere in the vastness of the tundra, wolves began to sing songs that spoke of ice ages and ancient paths, of guardians who walked in storms, of mysteries that wore both ordinary and extraordinary shapes. Evelyne closed her notebook, content to let the night hold its secrets. She had become both observer and observed, both scientist and storyteller, both keeper of facts and holder of mysteries. That, too, was its own kind of truth. The stars wheeled overhead, telling stories older than memory. The wolves sang their eternal songs. And somewhere in the spaces between such moments, other shapes moved, watching, guarding, reminding those with eyes to see that some things could never be fully explained. They could only be witnessed, remembered, honored for what they were, mysteries that walked in wolf shape through the endless white silence of the north. And that was enough. That was everything. That was true.
Thank you for illuminating your imagination with the listening lamp. If our tale has sparked a light in your mind, we invite you to keep that flame burning. Subscribe to our podcast and join us again as we continue to explore the vast cosmos of human experience. Until next time, may your inner light guide you through the mysteries that await.